Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 8th annual Drugs and Devices Australia webinar. I'm Sarah Griffin, and I'm here with my colleague, George Papadopoulos. So we expect this will take about 45 to 50 minutes. Please put any questions in the chat, and we'll try and answer them as we go along or at the end. Also, if we miss a question, you can email us, and this webinar is being recorded and we'll post it on our website and on LinkedIn, so there'll be plenty of access to it afterwards. So I'm just making a small declaration in the interest of transparency. I have been endorsed as Labor candidate for Willoughby in the New South Wales state election. It doesn't have much relevance for this webinar, as we're dealing almost primarily with federal matters. Okay, well, let's get started. So I'm not sure how many of you are from overseas or in Australia, but very, very quickly we'll just set the scene for how our device reimbursement system works from a very high level. We have a universal healthcare system called Medicare, which covers every person, and about half of all Australians also have private health insurance. Private health insurance is basically hospital cover, and it has some limited ancillary cover such as physio and dentist, but it doesn't include primary care, and it usually doesn't include pharmaceuticals except in some circumstances. So as a result, we have a bit of a weird mix of public and private hospital systems. This can be quite fragmented, and there can be lots of perverse incentives within the system. So we'll have a look at medical technologies in private hospitals, and that's probably where the focus of today's session will be on, because that's where most of the action is happening. So the medical benefits schedule is part of Medicare, and it's a list of medical procedures subsidised by Medicare. And a procedure must be included on the MBS to be covered by private health insurance. And implantable devices, hips, pacemakers, vascular grafts and things like that, get a payment over and above what the hospital will receive for the admission. So that's quite a significant payment. And devices that are not implanted can be at somewhat of a disadvantage. So what's been happening in 2022? So we had a change of government in May this year. Quite a seismic change in Australian politics. The current government was in opposition for 9 years. And a big change was we have a significant crossbench of mainly progressive politicians. So all the colours, teals and greens for those of you in Australia. And COVID is no longer a significant political issue and isn't taking up much space. So there's been significant reform from the PBAC space, which George will go through. But at this stage, there doesn't appear to be any change in policy implementation and the existing reform process in the device space. So private health insurances are continuing an aggressive campaign around medical device pricing. This has been going on for some years and showed no sign of abating. So the prostheses reform legislation is expected to be introduced to Parliament this year, but unlikely to be debated or passed until sometime next year. But a large proportion of the reforms can be implemented without legislation. So we've got the usual headlines. Basically, there's been a public stoush about medical device pricing. Nothing new. The private health insurers always say that the device prices are too high. The hospitals are concerned about some devices being removed from the prostheses list. And so generally, it's sort of a bit more of the same, except the reforms are progressing, and that's being reflected in the headlines. So as I said, most of the action this year has been in the prostheses list space. So Mark Butler, who is the new Minister of Health and Aged Care, has undertaken to honour the previous Health Minister's agreement with industry, and that was a memorandum of understanding signed in March 2022, this year. So reforms have been underway throughout 2022 with consultation with the industry, but not necessarily in agreement with industry. So despite the consultation, there's really been not a huge amount of alteration of the way the department sees the reforms being implemented. And the reforms will be implemented over the next 4 years. So, as I said, most of the reforms are in the prostheses list phase, and they've been pretty tough for industry. One of the main things is that the prostheses list prices will be reference priced with the public hospital system prices to establish the gap in price between private and public hospitals, if any. So the private health insurers have consistently maintained that there's excessive difference in prices in the public system and the private system. And so the agreement was reached that any decreases would be based on that gap established by an analysis of data, which is too complex for me to go into at this point. So the industry has absorbed some cuts over the last few years. So these cuts are on top of those. So as I said, the difference between the public and private price has been calculated. And in July this year, 40% of that gap was taken off the prices. The same thing's going to happen in July 2023. And I think I've made a mistake there. I think that should be 40% instead of 20%. I'm almost sure. So sorry about that. And in July 2024, 20% reduction, and that will be the end of these round of price reductions. So devices that have a gap of less than 7% above the weighted public price will not have any price reduction. So this is a bit of a nod to the fact that there are differences in the public and private system that negate, that provide some difference in the cost. So one of the other major reforms that the industry is very invested in and concerned about is what's called the regrouping process. So products on the prostheses list are categorised by clinical specialties like cardiac and vascular and neurosurgical, etc. And then they're further subdivided into groups, you know, to denote the type of device. And there's further demarcation by what they call a suffix or an additional note that might describe a particular feature of each group. But importantly, devices in the same group receive the same price or benefit. So a consultant to the department has been tasked with rationalising this complex list and reducing the number of separate categories. And I think the department and the consultant didn't quite realise how complicated this process was likely to be. And so it has been taking quite a long time. And I'm not quite sure when that's going to be delivered, but I believe sometime in the new year. So importantly, the regrouping project is not intended to force further price reductions. So next wonderful step in the reforms are the removal of general use items. Now, this is a term that hasn't been used and was pretty much, I don't want to say made up, but introduced by the Department of Health. And what they're referring to are items on the prostheses list that can be used across a large variety of different procedures. So a lot of them are not that expensive, but some of them are. So infusion pumps, but this doesn't include insulin pumps, which are not being removed, gastrostomy tubes, powder, I'm actually not quite sure what that is, sponges, pliable patches, ligating devices, not all of them, but some, staples and tackers, which are closure devices, liquid sealants and self-adhesives, arterial closure devices, which is quite a significant number of devices, and some percutaneous catheters. So that's a big list. The reason this happened is that private health insurers had noted a significant increase in the use of these devices and felt that it was inappropriate. That's to be debated, but nevertheless, the outcome of that is that these items are to be removed from the prosthesis list. So how that's going to happen is in 3 stages. So in July this year, there was a 60% reduction in that price, or I think in the gap price. I'd have to check up on that one. Sorry about that. And in March 1st next year, another mistake, 2023, and final removal on July 2023. So they're still going to be funded. The arrangements haven't been determined as yet, but basically what is being negotiated between the private hospitals and the private health insurers are bundling arrangements. So I envisage that for each type of procedure or broad categories of procedures, there will be a bundle of devices that are paid for, and there'll be some discretion, I imagine, for surgeons to use what they need within that bundle. And those negotiations are ongoing, and they've been supported by the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority, and I have no idea how to pronounce that acronym, and I won't attempt it because I'll sound silly. But it used to be IPA, so it used to be the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority. Same body, just a different name. So obviously these are quite complex and somewhat fraught negotiations, and basically it's a negotiation as to who picks up the cost of these devices being removed from the prosthesis list. And so it's a battle between the health insurers and the hospitals. But they are being accounted for. It's just the exact methodology is not determined as yet. Okay, so there's new assessment pathways, and there's 3 different tiers. So this is quite a substantial change. So the initial assessment pathway, tier 1, is a departmental assessment only, and it's for class 2B, TGA class 2B devices and below. So it's devices that don't require a clinical or economic assessment. So basically that would be the simpler, Me Too devices. So perfect example would be a spinal surgery screw, which, it's pretty easy to look at and see that it's a screw and doesn't require a great deal of, if any, clinical or economic assessment. So that'll be the easiest pathway, and they estimate that 60% of devices will go through that pathway. The tier 2 pathway is defined as clinical or focused health technology assessment pathway, and that is further subdivided into tier 2A and tier 2B. Tier 2A is a clinical assessment only, where basically you're not asking for any difference in price, and tier 2B is clinical and economic assessment. Importantly, all class 3 devices, even if they are Me Too, must follow this pathway. Also, devices that are not well-established technology, or anyone who's claiming incremental improvement or different characteristics to the comparator. So this assessment will rely on comparative clinical effectiveness and or cost effectiveness. So tier 3 is really an assessment by the Medical Services Advisory Committee. And this will apply to devices where there is no relevant MDF item number. In that respect, there's no change, because that's what happens to these devices anyway. But again, there's this other criteria that if the device is novel or first-in-class technology, or if there are no appropriate comparators, that will also be referred to the Medical Services Advisory Committee. So one of the big reforms that really is going to have a big effect on industry is the implementation of cost recovery. So previously there's been a $600 application fee for each rebate code applied for, and that's going to dramatically change. So we can see these fees are quite significant. So there's list management fees for deleting or transferring the sponsorship of advice for $101 each, which can really add up when you've got lots of changes. There's a non-refundable application fee of $1,300, and then there's an assessment fee. So previously, where there was no assessment fee for Tier 2, there's a nearly $3,000 fee. And the focused HTA can actually get quite expensive. So we've got fees ranging from $9,000 to nearly $28,000. And it's a bit confusing for Tier 3 because they're only claiming $2,318, but MSAC itself is flagged introducing cost recovery. So going through that process may incur fees for the MSAC process, and this fee, I think, will just apply to the administrative fees of the prosthesis branch. There's also a risk-sharing agreement fee of $23,000, which I think is actually quite strange because risk-sharing has not been part of the prosthesis list in the past, or at least very, very infrequently. So it's more a feature of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So I'm not sure how it would be applied because there's multiple payers, which is dissimilar to the PBAC where there's one payer. But nevertheless, it's out there, so we have to envisage the possibility of risk-sharing arrangements. Okay, other stuff. So there's no proposed changes in the application timelines, which is a bit disappointing. The proposed application is a bit more complex, but mostly I didn't think it was too unreasonable. The prosthesis management system, which is the online application system, is to be sidelined. So, there's lots of problems with that system, but we're going to use the health products portal instead. So it might be a case that it might be better with the devil you know, because the health products portal can be quite challenging to use as well. But that's the plan. We're not quite sure when that's going to be implemented. So moving on from the Medical Services Advisory Committee, this is we've mentioned this earlier on, but this is the committee that evaluates new procedures to include on the medical benefits schedule. And we're not going to go through the process here because it's just too lengthy, but basically it's a very full health technology assessment with loads of scrutiny and very, very rigorous evaluation. So in the past, applicants in the device world that couldn't afford to do the submission themselves had access to what's called contracted assessment. But that's going to be more limited in the future and probably limited to community groups or physician groups, and with far less access for industry, which is going to be tough on some of the niche products because even though, because doing a submission is a lot of work and it can cost anywhere from $180,000 to $300,000 depending on the complexity. So our recent experience is not very different from our recent experiences in previous years. There's a very high evidence bar for MSAC. The contractor assessors who not only do submissions themselves, but will assess our submissions are of variable quality, and you have no control over that. And we've often found that new technologies are held to a much higher standard than the technologies that are already on an NBS. And we've also have seen a tendency for MSAC to expect outcome measures or modelling that weren't specified in the PICO. And the PICO is the agreed structure for the assessment. So we have found that we've had things thrown at us that we weren't expecting, or critiques that we weren't expecting, even when we followed the PICO to the letter. So if possible, it's good to try and anticipate any further requirements outside of the PICO, because there's no bar to including additional evidence. And what we've found just incredibly important is the support of clinicians and clinician groups and good engagement. So George and I have worked on a resubmission where we didn't have great engagement on the first submission, and but had excellent engagement on the second submission, and it really has made an incredible difference. So my predictions for 2023, I predict there'll be less uncertainty because the new government seems to be quite steady and doesn't seem to be going in for any big surprises. I think the PL reforms will continue to go ahead as we've outlined today, and the legislation will be passed without any great controversy. I think Labor's probably left aligned with private health insurers and possibly likely to treat their claims with somewhat more scepticism than the coalition. And there's going to be continuous funding pressures between the Commonwealth and states to the ongoing costs and backlog from COVID. And I'm done, and thank you. And over to George. I'm just going to check this one quick question. Do the prostheses list private cuts apply for all? That is part A, B, and C of the prostheses list. Okay, I'm pretty sure they applied at part A and C, but B, I think, is still being evaluated. So there's been a separate consultation around part B. So I might have a look into that for you because it's a good question. Oops. Okay, I'm just going to pass over to George now.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Well done for our 8th annual webinar. Just about calculating, that means our first one was in 2015, so we seem to be still going. Anyway, I will, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'm going to, as we have done for the last 7 years, I'll take over midway and we'll talk a little bit more on the pharmaceutical side, concentrating a little bit on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee and the PBS. And Sarah and I both start off with a little sort of intros, just to remind everybody, whether you're a new participant to our webinars. I think there's some veterans on the call we can see, including ourselves. So just to recap, top right-hand corner, with the changing government, the Department of Health is now the Department of Health and Aged Care, and that's why that Hospital Pricing Authority added Health and Aged Care, the acronym HAC in there. And to reiterate, Sarah mentioned, Medicare underpins our public reimbursement system, and for want of a better word, displays the medical benefits scheme, the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. They contribute to public hospitals, although that's partly state funded. And of course, aged care is a federal responsibility. I think we're still at about half of Australians have private health insurance. I think we're about 46%. And Sarah sort of covered off a lot on the private hospital and private health insurers. But I think from a pharmaceutical perspective, I think that most of their cover excludes pharmaceuticals, or is very limited ancillary cover. So consequently, we're a mix of public-private hospital system, public and private systems, and somewhat fragmented. There are some perverse incentives, which we're not going to really go into in this particular webinar. Again, just a couple of slides to reset the scene or set the scene. The Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, the PBS, essentially was set up to keep medicines affordable. It lists products by brand name, generic. It includes biologics and biosimilar medicines. And it is part of the broader national medicines policy, which is finally under review, which we'll get to towards the end. To get onto the system or the PBS, there's a procedure guidance and the guidelines, which most people hopefully are familiar with. And Australians, once we get onto that, once the pharmaceutical gets onto the PBS, the main thing is that Australians, we only pay a small co-pay, which are going down a little bit, and the government pays the rest. And clearly, if you're a concession card holder or pensioner, your co-pays are somewhat less as well. All right. I just wanted to go into a little bit in this slide because we talk about health technology assessment. And just to dovetail back with Sarah, you can see that all the systems are essentially moving towards using health technology assessment for their decision making. So again, for the novices maybe on the call, there's assessment routes for drugs, devices, and diagnostics. You have to be registered and get onto the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods at the top there. Sarah sort of went through the middle and the right-hand side here about Medical Services Advisory Committee and the Prosthesis Advisory Plaque. We're not going to go through that again, but just to highlight that they are moving or have moved to an HTA type system. And of course, if you're a medicine or if you have a medicine or vaccine, to get onto the National Immunisation Program, NIP schedule, which is here on the right, you still have to go through the PBAC assessment and to get your drug listed on the PBS. And over on the right-hand side, just a couple of other reimbursement programs administered federally, which have sort of also moved into the HTA space, or some of them were already there. So the Life-Saving Drugs Program, which is the top there, LSDP, it was reviewed a few years ago. We talked about it. It still remains outside the system, so to speak. However, drugs for that system still go through the PBAC assessment. And we sort of just quickly mentioned the NIP, the National Immunisation Program. The vaccines also go through this HTA assessment from the PBAC. And the National Blood Authority, it's another statutory body. It manages and coordinates the supply of blood products and services on behalf of the government and the states and territories. It too is sending, say, the new or higher cost drugs or medicines like haemophilia drugs, etc., to MSAC for an HTA type assessment before they decide on value and price. So HTA remains a cornerstone in Australia for proving value for money and reimbursement. Is the main outcome of this slide. So just the next slide about price spending. Apologies on the in the system. This is stored from the budget review from Australia 2022-23. Just to show that the PBS is the PBS is the second line item there. You can see it's pretty stable over the forward estimates. The main thing to highlight here is pharmaceuticals is relatively small. It's the third largest bucket in the government's budget after medical services benefit, and then the federal government's assistant to the hospital, the state for hospitals. So, but in real terms, it looks like to be declining in real terms. Just to move into sort of some new information that to follow up from last year, we sort of tried to look at the next three slides are around what's happening in terms of submissions, categories, and sort of just a statistic. It's not really statistical. It's descriptive statistics on what's happening with the submissions and so forth. So we looked back 3 years, 3 meetings, November 21, March 22, July 22. We're using the Mouse database as our source of information. That's the source at the bottom. And you can, if you recall from last year's webinar where we talked about the new categories, so minor and majors have disappeared from the lexicon of submissions. It's categories 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can clearly see the old major submissions would have been category 1 and category 2, and they still dominate the submissions that the department's seeing. And then you can see the resubmission pathways. If you recall, there's 4 in particular. The early re-entries seem to be the early re-entries, and the standard re-entries seem to be the dominant resubmission pathways. The early resolution and the facilitated resolution seem to be less likely to be used. And then I just put the table up there so you can actually see the actual numbers. Obviously, we'll update again to see what happens in November. Just didn't get a chance for this particular webinar. So that's by submission category. If you look at the therapeutic area over those 3 meetings again, it hasn't really changed over the previous years. Oncology and sort of immunology dominate in terms of absolute number of submissions, followed by neurology and endocrinology. And then if you look at submissions and outcomes, it's a bit hard to graphically represent it, so I've just put it together as a table. If you look at the meeting, November at the top, March in the middle, July at the bottom, and you look at the new listings, you can see, it's about half are recommended, and of the ones that are new PBS listings. I think there's still a few rejections. We haven't really analysed it much further about what rate, what ISO band and so forth. That's for a future project as we're going along. I think it's pretty stable is the main question, a main point of the table. So another 2 pieces of research we did recently, and Mouse and Blaze, Graceto's main leader on that, was looking at analysis of risk share agreements in Australia between 2013 and 2021. I recently presented at ISPOR as well, so I've just taken the opportunity to use it and present it here to the team, to the group. So if you look at the 2 graphs, the one on the right, figure 1 is the number of PBAC positive recommendations with RSA split by therapeutic area. And you can see they're probably slightly increasing in number over the years, 2013 to 2021, dominated by oncology and immunomodulating agents. So they've sort of, you can see it's grown from 3 to 18 in 2021. So there was significant growth in the expected use of RSAs. And as we said, RSAs for immunological oncology products have sort of remained stable at between 8 to 10 per year. And it's remained stable. And you can see on the left-hand side, the figure between those years, 2013 to 2021, proportion of recommendations, again, back into the major category, which ones had an RSA and which ones didn't. and it's kind of been stable over the last few years. The other piece of research or work we did was analysis of special pricing arrangements, which is another aspect of the system in Australia, which we, again, I think we've talked about the last couple of years. That's a plug to go back and look at all our previous webinars and that are online on our websites and so forth. Fascinating listening and reading, I must say. So if you look at the number of PBS listed drugs with an SPA, special pricing arrangements, it's increased immensely. I would say from 52 in 2013 to 143 in 2021. Could argue to be a bit stable over the last 3 or 4 years. And as with the risk share agreements, and these things go together, we haven't actually looked at the correlation, but the therapeutic classes with the largest number of SPAs are, anti-neoplastic oncology and the immunosuppressants, and you can see some of the numbers there. So I've said it's remained quite stable over the time. Okay, so I just copying Sarah's slide, PBAC process and just some of the numbers and issues we've gone through, like what are our recent experiences. I would say a bit like Sarah, I think it's changed a little, a bit stable, but maybe a couple of things that I think have improved maybe. I still believe we still recommend that pre-PBAC submission meetings are an integral part of the process, and we shouldn't skip them, or you shouldn't skip them, especially for those cost effectiveness requiring cost effectiveness type submissions, category 1 and 2, where you're looking for an increased price. I still think it remains that cost minimization analyses are all expected or do get first time recommendations. There may be some pricing discussions after the positive recommendation, but they're all, I believe, getting through pretty easily. I do also believe, at least the ones we've been working with, the cost effectiveness recommendations aren't getting through that first time. So I think they're still, whether it's a 1.5 average or a 1.7 average, we haven't looked at it recently. But I think if you do a good cost effectiveness submission, the early re-entry resubmission pathway is working well, and I think we're getting good advice from the department and the PBAC about that pathway and what's expected. And I believe the PBAC has been a bit more targeted and direct of what ISO they require, rightly or wrongly, but they are at least being targeted. I also think the evaluation, or we believe the evaluation commentary in the DUSC advice has gotten better and clearer. And as I probably just pointed out in the previous slides, I think an SPA, especially for the cost effectiveness recommendations, an SPA and an RSA still remain 2 key strategies to obtain a recommendation and a listing. So I'd be interested to hear if anyone else any other comments on those or not. So again, I've stolen Sarah's slide and I've just changed the third bullet point to red to highlight that there has been a lot of significant reforms in the space, in the PBAC space. Some have led to controversy, some have been silly, I think, for want of a better word. So the next couple of slides, we're not going to dive into detail. I'm going to pick out snippets and just highlight how many reviews are ongoing and comments and so forth. So if we go to the next very busy slide, and that's on purpose to show that there's a lot happening, and this is only a snippet of what's going on, which takes up industry time and department time. So there's consultation of the revised post-marketing review framework. That's the top left-hand corner. The national, there's the HTA review, or technically called the Health Technology Assessment Policy Methods Review. There's a reference committee that's been redone. It's kind of kicking off. Various companies are involved in Medicines Australia. There's been an efficient funding of chemotherapy review. An interim report has been released. We personally haven't been too involved in that one. I'm going to talk about the top right one in a minute on a separate slide, but it's the sort of came out of the blue. Not much is known about it, but there's an agreement signed with the government, and it's not the PBAC specifically, but it's the Department of Health Aged Care with some of its counterparts around the world in the United Kingdom, which is basically the England, Wales, Scotland, and Canada. And I'll go about that in the next slide a little bit. And of course, the ongoing National Medicines Policy Review. So, I mean, we could spend another hour talking about these individually, which we won't, but it's here just to highlight how many things are ongoing. There's a few more slides on what's happening as well. But I think from my perspective, I think the one that's going to have policy and maybe other implications as well, and has not been, it looks to be agreed without industry involvement, and it was just announced on the website, and then there's nothing, hasn't been much announced other than that, is that our Department of Health and Aged Care has signed an international collaboration agreement with 5 like-minded health technology assessment bodies. So, and they've sort of agreed to a range of process and mechanisms on what they're going to do. And it says, including quality, safety, efficacy, effectiveness, and cost effectiveness of technologies. And they include medicines, medical services, and prostheses in that as well. And they've said the arrangement sets out a framework to support shared strategic objectives in several priority areas. There's 5 of them, which are below. And we've gone through who the people are, who the agencies are. Again, this agreement, it says, will allow the partners, those 5 agencies, to work together on shared priorities to identify solutions to some of those common challenges that they believe they face. So the 5 that agreed, COVID-19, it's probably a no-brainer, working with the regulatories and so authorities and so planning future HTAs and approaches for economic modelling. As we all know, during the pandemic, vaccination programs, vaccine pricing, all of that, it was essentially bypassed the HTA process, and we got what we wanted in lightning speed and a little bit of lack of transparency on the pricing that we all paid for it as taxpayers. So that'll be interesting. And I think the next 3 are probably the most interesting ones to find out more how they will do this, is future-proofing HTA systems. So I think, what does that actually mean? The sub-bullet point is exchanging ideas on how these processes could better anticipate and technologies and methodological challenges before they become an issue. Is that horizon scanning, which I know there's a separate work group, which I haven't mentioned, that's going to be happening with the Medicines Australia and the government. Interestingly, they're going to collaborate with regulators, which has been interesting. But to me, the most interesting one is number 4, which is work sharing and efficiency gain. Apparently, these 5 partners are going to explore the feasibility of recognising or using each other's HTA information and explore running a pilot for a joint clinical assessment. I think it's interesting that they say joint clinical assessment and not joint clinical and cost effectiveness assessment. So we'll see. Again, I think it's an interesting development. Not a lot has been published around it or discussed. So I look forward to seeing if we discuss it in 2023 or 24. And so just to continue with the amazing amount of reviews and extra work that's been looked at, the department has put together the Closing the Gap initiative about PBS co-payment programs and so forth. And have legislated through, you would have seen some press around that the co-pay is going down, so from $42.50 to $30 for general. What they didn't really talk about in the press is the little sneaky concessional co-pay is going up from $6.80 to $7.30. So our pensioners and veterans and so forth get slugged a little bit more, as opposed to the general public's going to save a little bit. I think it's a good thing in terms of at least the general co-pay going down 30. I think they could have held the concessional to the same amount or even lower. And then the thresholds have increased a little bit as well, which is always good. Another main thing for the Medicines Australia agreement was the review of the discount rate in the PBAC guidelines. A lot of people put a lot of work into it. The PBAC deliberated at the last meeting, and I did read the report. It basically said, don't change it. It's complicated, and I didn't expect anything else from them. But interestingly, I tried to go look at the report this morning, and it seems to have disappeared from the department's website. So I don't know if that's a technical glitch or they've formally withdrawn the report from the from public display and public view. So that'll be interesting. To me, the discount rate is not the issue in Australia. That's a side issue, and we shouldn't be bothering too much about it, personally. What we should be bothering about is my last slide, which is price reductions and forced price reductions and the continued price disclosure downward trend, and also I think, bad agreement of statutory price discount, statutory price decreases, and the catch-up ones in particular. And again, there's been a lot of publicity, discussion, companies' efforts and time, but there's been, I won't read through all of that stuff there, but the main thing at the bottom right-hand corner is quite a few items have been swept up into it. At least if you look at the spreadsheet, there's 963 items. And I say items because it's not just drugs, there's multiple presentations. And if you calculate the average price reduction that's going to potentially happening 1st of April, it's a mean reduction of 23.51% for no reason other than the department decided to legislate it after the MOU with Medicines Australia. The range of price decrease is 1.48 to 36.82. Of course, and again, I think we've heard you're allowed to ask for ministerial discretion to not get those done for a variety of reasons. I think a lot of people have a lot of companies, have submitted ministerial discretion. They're starting to roll out. We won't really know which ones have been approved formally or not until the April the 1st, 2023 effective date. And just to end on another last slightly humorous point, I'm not sure if the department specifically chose April Fool's Day to announce all these price decreases. I hope they're not that smart. In any case, I thought it was quite amusing. So that's it for me in terms of the update. And on the pharmaceutical side, thank you. We have some time for questions, and you can always email, text, call Sarah and I individually as well.
So, George, just a couple of questions.
Oh, God.
So, what trends are you seeing in the PBAC assessments that you've been involved in?
I think one of the good trends I've seen is when we're getting early re-entry resubmission recommendations, the department, I think it's the department, but the department and the PBAC are giving pretty clear advice, or I say advice, but it's almost instructions around the 5 or 6 things they want to see happen in those early resubmissions. And you basically have to set up a table to tell them we've done A, B, C, D, if they've asked for A, B, C, D.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And if you go outside that, you've got to have a really good reason, because they're not the early re-entries are not evaluated formally. The secretariat overviews them. And if you add too much in, which I think we've done with one recently, it's been deferred. And so I'm going to be interested to see what the reason for the deferral was, because I thought we answered everything. And I think the other trend is, not considered a trend, I think the PVAC, I think, does like to see the risk share agreements a little bit more detail in the actual submission. It's a twin-edged sword. You want to give away too much too early. So I think it's a little bit of a balancing act. I think that's probably two of the main ones I can think off the top of my head in terms of favourable trends. And I think, at least from our point of view, I think we're getting pretty good evaluation commentaries and good ESC advice reports. You know, I think in the past we've had some pretty terrible ones, so to speak, in terms of quality.
Yeah, it's like what we see in the MSAC space.
Yeah,
sometimes.
I think back to what I was saying earlier, I think the pre-submission meetings, if you can, we try to ask really targeted questions, and we've had about 3 or 4 in the last 6 months. I think they've been very well attended, and they've been very well researched by the government, maybe because the clients are paying for them, so there's an onus on them to perform. And I think some of that advice has been very good. Some of it we hadn't thought of, to be honest, before we got to the meeting. So some of the answers have been very informative for the actual strategic nature of the submission.
Okay, there's one more question.
Sure.
So the price decreases, the April Fool's Day price decreases. Do you think as a result many companies will leave the market, or specific drugs will be removed from the PBS?
We have one client where we've told the department that we will withdraw the product from the PBS, make it cash only customer. I think that's not an isolated incident.
Yeah.
And my personal opinion, and I know this is being recorded, I'm happy for it to be online. I think every company should put in price increases for every single drug that's on the PBS and see how they can handle that, as opposed to withdraw the drugs, flood the department with price increases, requests.
Well,
I'll leave it with that thought.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, everyone. Our contact details are there. We'll send you a recording of this, and we're happy if you want to email us questions. So, happy end of the year. Happy holidays. Yes, happy. Yes.
Have a wonderful festive season, and
Yes.
happy New Year, and see you in 2023 out in the wide world.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our, can't believe, our 8th annual Drugs and Devices Australia webinar. I'm Sarah Griffin, and I'm here with my colleague, George Papadopoulos. So we expect this will take about 45 to 50 minutes.